70,000 plus South Africans wants to flee South Africa to America. But are they ready for the reality? I spoke to Professor Ronnie Amit. She's a law professor at Massachusetts School of Law. She teaches immigration law there and she also directs the law clinic, and asked her to give us all a reality check. So, Ronnie, what are the legal criteria for Afrikaners to qualify for refugee status? What does the law in the USA say?
So there isn't really a law governing how Afrikaners would get refugee status in the US. In general, the refugee resettlement program goes through an established process, and there's a certain number of refugees that it gets set by the president every year for how many will be let in. That process has been entirely shut down right now under the current administration. So it's not really clear by what process people from South Africa would get in. The executive order does make reference to the refugee admissions program, but that has also been suspended by President Trump. So really unclear what the process would be.
Let's quickly look to your history in terms of immigration law. How many refugees are allowed annually, or is it a once off? How often is there a review? How are those decisions made?
So generally, that number gets set every year by the president. So it varies. And it was decreased significantly during the first Trump administration and then went back up under Biden, though not to previous levels. I think it got up to maybe 60 or 75,000, though I'm not sure. I would have to check those numbers, but traditionally it's been higher than that. And right now they're not letting anybody in. But generally, there is an established process you have to go through, which starts with being identified as a refugee by UNHCR, the UN refugee organization. And you have to meet the legal criteria for a refugee, both under international law and under US law.
So, for those who aren't familiar with what this legal criteria is and what it entails, just elaborate on that, please.
So generally, to meet the definition of a refugee, you have to show that you have a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So it's not just fleeing any type of violence or danger, but violence that's specifically linked to one of those criteria. And then you have to show that your government is unable or unwilling to protect you.
How do you show that your government is unwilling or unable to protect you? What kind of proof or evidence do you supply, if at all?
So it's a much harder burden to meet if the government is not the actor who is persecuting you. If it's a non-state actor, then you have to show a lot more evidence of what the government is doing or failing to do. And that can be anything from looking at the state's laws to looking at country reports that talk about the government's complicity in those actions. And those criteria have been interpreted differently by different courts. Usually, it's a much harder showing if you're trying from within the US. If you are trying for refugee resettlement and going through UNHCR, oftentimes those are people who are in refugee camps and have gotten sort of group-based designation, and then UNHCR will make the determination that those people are not safe in their current location they've already been designated as refugees, they're not safe, and then they will assist them in resettling in a third country.
How long does this process take?
It is not a fast process. It can take 2 years or longer because there are various steps and screening and interviews that you have to go through.
So, do you apply for refugee status when you outside the USA, or do you find yourself by whatever means to be in the USA and then you apply from there?
So if you are outside the US, then you are considered a refugee. You would apply not directly to the US, you would get designated as a refugee in another country or by the UN, and then you would apply for refugee resettlement. If you are already inside the US, then you would apply for asylum. That's the US makes a distinction, which it does not exist in international law. It's just part of US law that if you're inside the country, you're applying for asylum. If you're outside the country, you're entering as a refugee.
So that's the definition. Defining factor is where you find yourself during or before that application.
Yes, and so it's a different process. The application process is different, but the legal definition is the same for a refugee or an asylee.
Just quickly inform us a little bit about the asylum seekers. And you said there's a differentiation between seeking asylum and applying for refugee status. How is it a higher level that you're on? How is that application dealt with?
So in theory, it's the same showing that you have to make. You have to show that you meet the legal definition of a refugee. It's just the process for doing that is going to differ depending on whether you're inside the US. And if you're inside the US, you have to do it within a year of arrival. And it also will depend on if the government has already found you, if you have any other status while you're here, if you entered informally or not. That will determine whether you apply at an asylum office, which is a non-adversarial proceeding, or whether you are in immigration court, which is an adversarial proceeding, meaning there's a DHS attorney on the other side who is arguing against your asylum. Again, if you're outside the US, then you need to get that refugee designation, usually through UNHCR, and then they will start the process of refugee resettlement. But there's no way for you. There's no way for you to decide from outside the country, I want to apply to be a refugee and apply. You can't apply directly to the US if you're outside the country.
I'm going to come back to that point in a moment, particularly because we're talking about this invitation that the President Donald Trump issued to Afrikaners in South Africa. How you think, how could that in any way play out? I know these are new times for all of us. You spoke about the DHS attorney. What is that? Who is that? What department is that?
So, sorry, that's
the Security, Homeland Security.
Yeah, Department of Homeland Security, who is the department in charge of immigration enforcement. And so it's an ICE attorney, right? So ICE is the part of DHS, and they are doing the enforcement within the interior. So they will be the attorney arguing against granting you asylum, and you're arguing in front of an immigration judge. The immigration judge, also part of the executive branch, so it's not really an independent court. So you have the judge who's a member of the executive branch, and the attorney on the other side who's also a member of the executive branch.
Well, ICE has been in the news of late, and that's another discussion for another day. How does the vetting work? Explain it to us. This is your field of expertise. How long? You said earlier it could take up to 2 years. Let's assume I'm applying outside the USA, and I can then apply for refugee status. I have proven somehow that I'm being persecuted by my government. I'm not feeling safe because I'm black. Now, what do I do further, and what does the US government do to vet me, to make sure that there is truth in what I claim and that it corroborates the statements that I, under an oath, make?
So yeah, so the first thing is getting that recognition from UNHCR, and then they will send you to what's called a resettlement support center for further interviews, and then usually you'll have an individual interview with a representative from DHS, and then there's a pretty extensive security and background vetting and check, and then you also have to undergo medical clearance, and only then are you eligible to actually come to the country.
So all of that I have to get the go ahead that I can now enter the country. I assume I get some kind of acknowledgement or a receipt or some form of a document that states when I get to the US border, I can enter the country. Take me through that process. I'm assuming a lot here, and I know we accept that we speak in terms of generally, because these are very different times, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what generally happens?
You mean once you've been approved?
Yes.
Yeah. So then you would get some sort of visa authorizing you to enter the country, but that doesn't guarantee that you will be admitted, because anytime you are entering the U.S., CBP, which is the Customs and Border Protection, which is also part of the Department of Homeland Security, they operate at all the borders, and it's ultimately that official's decision whether or not they're going to let you in, even if you have a valid visa saying that you have been granted, that you should be granted entry.
So you can't assume just because you've been approved that that is an automatic entry into the country. That would be
Correct.
dangerous.
Yeah. And that holds true for anyone who has a visa to enter the US.
When I'm there, what happens to me? Do we only see people living in camps? We only see people being put in a center of sorts. Where do you go after that?
So the US doesn't have refugee camps. So traditionally, there were programs in the US, refugee resettlement programs, who would provide assistance to refugees when they arrive. They would help get them set up. They would get some financial assistance to help them get settled. Again, all of that has been suspended under the Trump administration. So none of that is happening right now.
So it's all up in the air, because whilst that has been suspended, access to funds, access to processes, you would be risking, this is my assumption, you'd be risking a lot if you thought, while we're as a collective from South Africa going to the USA because the president invited us and said we can apply, but all these funds and resources has been, I would assume, temporarily suspended. So there is no certainties whatsoever at the moment, Ronnie. That this is what it sounds like to me.
Yes, that's true. And in fact, there were people who had recently arrived as refugees, and from one day to the next, that assistance and support was cut off, and they were just kind of left on their own to figure it out.
My word. And so where are they? Is there some kind of record keeping, though?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because the organizations right, they've lost their funding. The people who were working for them lost access to their records. So it's not really
Wow.
clear. There's private organizations and NGOs who stepped in to try and fill those gaps, but it's hard for them to even locate those people because they don't have access to that information.
You said that it is the president's prerogative, the amount of refugees who are allowed into the country.
Mhm.
Is there a precedent where a president would issue an invitation en masse to a country or a people to come to his country as refugees? Is there some kind of precedent in your USA immigration law that leaves room for these kinds of actions, these kinds of invitations?
So, to my knowledge, we haven't seen that since we passed our current refugee law, which was passed in 1980. Prior to that, you did see group designations for people like Cubans or people fleeing communist regimes, or after the Vietnam War and the fall of Saigon, people from that area. You did get some group-based designations, but I don't think we've really seen anything like this since the passage of our refugee law in 1980.
I'm just curious, what was the response within the legal fraternity when this invitation was issued?
Um, for those of us who work in immigration law and work with refugees and asylum seekers, I think there was a lot of shock and feeling that this was absurd and not in any way rooted in refugee law.
So are you all just uh, what's your approach to this? Is it wait and see? Is it because one day is completely different from the next? There seems to be so much uncertainty, and I'm very grateful that you allowed us and created time for me to ask some of these questions, because here in South Africa there is a lot of confusion, but there's been indications that over 700,000 apparently South Africans have shown an intention of wanting to take up the president's offer. But I would imagine, with so much uncertainty in the USA, within also the legal fraternity that deals with immigration law, everything or nothing is on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, most of us, we view this as a political statement and nothing more, because there are no mechanisms in place to actually implement it. And I think we're far more focused on what's happening to the people who really do have protection needs. And because our asylum system has also basically been shut down, and we're seeing people who are in the country and who have applied for asylum who are being swept up in these massive arrests and being detained and deported and sent to really dangerous positions. So that's really what most of us are focused on. I don't think any of us are taking this situation with Afrikaners, quite honestly, very seriously, because there's just no clear indication of how it would become a reality in any way.
What rights do South Africans lose when they accept refugee status in the US? Or not just only South Africans, any other countryman and a refugee from Cuba or Russia. What do they have to, what benefits do they have? What do they have to gain? And what do they have to lose?
So the main thing you lose really is the ability to maintain connection with your home country, because if you are a refugee, you cannot avail yourself of the protection of your home country, because if you're able to do that, then that suggests that you don't really have a well-founded fear of being in that country. So That is I think the main right really that you give up is those ties to your home country. Um, Otherwise, refugees in the U.S. have access to most rights. They're entitled to work and study. So it's really just more, the right to vote and some of those political rights that they don't have.
So once you enter the country as a refugee, you can go live wherever you want to. You have the same rights besides voting, like naturalized or a citizen of the US.
No, you do not have the right to, yeah, you have the same right, most of the same rights other than voting, correct. Although in the current environment, that is becoming less clear because it seems like even if you're a legal permanent resident, you don't have the same rights to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that in the past you have had. So I think refugees, just like what we're seeing with the targeting of other categories of migrants, would be right now probably subject to some of those same constraints. Although in the law,
We've seen,
yeah, I mean, I think the legal
yes,
precedent
continue.
precedent says you do have those rights, but in practice, we're seeing that people are being punished for exercising those rights.
There's been talk that the designated group Afriforum Solidariteit, who represent some of their members, they do not speak for all white South Africans, that they have asked, or offer was, a suggestion was put on the table, that Afrikaners, when they are accepted as refugees in the USA, should have a designated area like we have in South Africa, where some citizens prefer to live in Oranje, for example, that there's a designated area, land, whatever, allocated for them. Is that the kind of way that things are done in the US, that you can, as a refugee, make those kind of requests or negotiate it?
Not to my knowledge. That is a new one to me. I have not heard anything along those lines. But that said, we do seem to be in a whole new world right now. So I would say, it wouldn't surprise me. Nothing is off the table at this point, but I have never heard of anything like that before.
You mentioned earlier that the under your law, although a lot of stuff has changed since, that the refugees were entitled to some kind of financial support. What other benefits do they qualify for? Or do they initially have to take care of themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know the details. I think it's about 6 months of financial support. And then, yeah, they are expected to work and support themselves. I think they are entitled to some of the same social services that US citizens would be eligible for, although I don't think not necessarily all of those, but certainly they would be entitled to some of those.
Mm. Can you give us an idea of how generally you prepare refugees when they enter the country? Is there some form of orientation that happens? Because I would imagine it's a foreign country, foreign culture, new ways, foreign currency. Is there some kind of support other than the financial support that we spoke about? Because you're talking about displacement, you're talking about suddenly you are no longer as free and independent as you were in your own country, whether that was compromised or not. Is there some kind of orientation? Like when you're a new worker in a new job, there's a plan for you to become part of the nation, become part of the workforce.
So I think generally they do have an orientation program before they come to the US. And then once they arrive, it's really those refugee resettlement organizations who are providing the social assistance. And so they are helping them get acclimated and sort of showing them the lay of the land and helping them get set up with, things like getting their kids in school and helping them find jobs and really helping them orient themselves once they arrive. And that is, like, as I mentioned, there were people who were in that process and from one day to the next just lost that.
So I'm now accepted. I live in the US. Am I then allowed to sponsor my other family members if they want to join me in the US?
So that depends. Generally, you can bring your immediate family, so your spouse and your children. And then once you are, once you've become a US citizen, or in some cases a legal permanent resident, you may be able to sponsor additional members of the family, but there are generally really long waiting periods for that.
Mm. But do you have to get permission somehow? How long is that process? Do you have to wait until you first either settled or you're a citizen? Enlighten us.
So usually if you are coming as a refugee, you would have included your family members on your application. And so you would come as a family.
Mm. How does the integration in the US work? We've always lauded the US as the land of the free. It was an amalgamation of so many cultures, a melting pot of diversity that you could live out your culture and embrace it, and it was welcomed the difference. But it seems that there's a slant, there's a difference now in this administration and the way they deal with people that are different, or the othering of people. Talk to me about that, because the South Africans, or the Afrikaners that then are in the USA, will also come with a different culture. They will also find it difficult to integrate. So how is that viewed?
I think it really varies on a lot of different things, right? I think it depends on which culture you're coming from, and your appearance in some respects. And then also, I think it just depends on where in the US you go, right? There are some parts of the country that value that difference much more, whereas other parts of the country are more resistant to it. And I think we saw that right during the presidential debates when they highlighted, right, that there were certain migrants who were eating pets, which was not true, but in parts of the country, that was the narrative that we heard.
Mhm. Ronnie, you direct the immigration law clinic. You're at the University of Massachusetts, and you are a professor in immigration law. Make it make sense how you set the framework for discussion to your students of what's happening in your country, but with particular reference to immigration law. And as you said earlier, people just being picked up, legal citizens being picked up and deported, or taken without their knowledge back home.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure that I can make it make sense. It's an ongoing conversation with the students because there is very much this disconnect between you're talking about the law and all of these legal precedents, but then you're looking at what's happening in real life, and there is a disconnect. And so it's really unclear. And in many ways, right, my immigration law class has become a constitutional law class, right? Because we're very much talking about, is this legal under the Constitution? Can they do this? What powers do they have? And really, what what tools or mechanisms do we have to push back on this, if any? But I think everyone, right, we're in our uncharted territory right now. So everyone is kind of trying to figure it out and trying to figure out if these longstanding precedents, legal precedents that we have, are going to remain.
In South Africa, there is a lot of talk about this invitation from President Trump and the 70,000 or 700,000, I'm not even sure anymore, that want to leave the country to go to the USA. From your experience and within immigration law and what you've seen, particularly also what's happening in your country, what would you say to those South Africans who are hopeful and who have actually added their names to the 700,000? I just want to double check my facts here to say that they would take him up on that offer, 70,000 would take him up on that offer and go. What should they be thinking about? What should they be considering? What's the reality? And I know you said earlier it keeps on differing day by day. What's the reality? What are they actually dealing with? And you had said early on, this isn't really top of mind in the USA with your students because you're more concerned about what's happening to your citizens.
Well, not to our citizens. Well, yes, to our citizens, but within the immigration context, what's happening to the migrants, the immigrants who are actually here, the asylum seekers who are here, the people who actually need protection. So, yeah, that is our concern. I mean, a lot of South Africans come to the United States. So, in some sense, I don't think these people, these Afrikaners, if they chose to come, would be any different. But, things are very much in flux right now. So it's really hard to know how things are going to progress and what's going to happen. And so even if some of them do make it here, I would say the law there's so many moving parts and so many legal challenges. So it's not even clear what legal status they would have and if those things would be challenged and how secure their situation would necessarily be legally if they were to come.
So there is a risk that this order could be overturned, not fully implemented, also completely off the table.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think the order is really nothing more than a political statement. And I think if steps were taken to try and implement it, then we would start to see a lot of legal challenges. I think nobody's really focused on challenging this order right now because it's a very low priority and it's very far from reality. So there are far more damaging orders in terms of the treatment of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. So I think that's where most of the focus is right now.
What's your opinion of the legalities in many of these cases that we've seen and executive orders that's been implemented? The way that the administration is dealing with the law, US law, because there have been judges that have issued orders and it's just been ignored, or some kind of a flimsy explanation of why it was received late. All these crazy reasoning for ignoring judges' decisions and legal orders. What do you make of this? What are your fears, Ronnie? What are your fears?
Yeah, I think this is something everyone is very concerned about right now. And, we hear the word constitutional crisis a lot, but yeah, I think really it's putting into question whether this country still operates under the rule of law and whether the rule of law still has any force at this point. And I think Yeah, a lot of the legal challenges are still ongoing, and some of these issues are still playing out, right? Like the legal hearings around the deportation of the Venezuelans to El Salvador, which is hugely problematic. And the judge continues to request more and more information from the government. So it's still in process. But what we've seen up till now is certainly very concerning. And I think people are starting to get very worried about what is happening because the courts don't really have any power to enforce. And so it just seems like there are potentially no limits on this.